The courthouse smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper, the kind of scent that lingered in government buildings, where generations of arguments and verdicts had stacked one upon another like layers of dust. On this particular morning, the air carried something sharper, something electric, as though the entire room understood it was about to host a moment that would be remembered far beyond the county records. Every seat was filled. Rows of journalists perched forward on the hard benches, pads of paper balanced on their knees, pens poised in anticipation. Court sketch artists had already filled their pages with rough outlines of the judge, the jury, box, and the imposing silhouette of the police dog at the center of the scene. The presence of so many reporters wasn't unusual for this case. For weeks it had been the talk of the town, the kind of trial that seeped from local headlines into national discussions. People debated it in diners, around office water coolers, even in grocery store checkout lines. The courthouse today was the beating heart of the city's attention. At the front of the room, behind the tall bench, Judge Harriet Latham adjusted her glasses with slow precision. Known for her no-nonsense demeanor and an unshakable reputation for impartiality, she had presided over dozens of high-profile trials, but even she felt the air different today. She could sense the eyes on her, not only from the crowded benches, but also from the wider audience waiting to consume every word outside the courthouse doors. Her gavel rested neatly at her right hand, a silent promise of order should the room slip out of control. To her left, 12 jurors shifted in their seats. Some stared at the polished floorboards. Others fixed their eyes on the ceiling as though looking anywhere but at the lawyers who would soon begin their arguments again. They were tired. The trial had already stretched longer than anyone anticipated, and each day carried its own strain of listening, weighing, and balancing details too heavy for ordinary citizens to comfortably carry. Yet here they sat, each sworn to do their duty, no matter how difficult. The defendant occupied the table closest to the jury. He was an unremarkable man in appearance, graying hair, a slight slouch, hands folded tightly in front of him. Yet the charges against him painted a picture far darker than his outward composure suggested. His attorney leaned close, whispering something into his ear, but the man didn't nod, didn't even blink. His eyes darted toward the police dog seated across the room, then quickly looked away. And what a dog it was! The German shepherd sat perfectly still beside his handler, Officer Mark Denham, a 20-year veteran of the force. The animal's ears twitched slightly at every shuffle and cough in the courtroom, but otherwise he seemed carved from stone. His thick coat gleamed under the lights, his dark eyes intelligent, calculating, and unreadable. People said this dog had solved more cases than some detectives. His nose had unearthed hidden drugs, tracked fugitives through forests, and even located evidence that officers had overlooked. To the public, he wasn't just a dog. He was a symbol of law itself, uncorrupted and incorruptible. That was why he was here. Not as a mere exhibit, not as a prop, but as proof. The prosecution had called for the dog to demonstrate how he had discovered key evidence in the case, evidence that tied the defendant to a crime scene he claimed never to have visited. It was unusual, even extraordinary, to have a police animal present in the courtroom, but Judge Latham had allowed it under strict supervision. And now, as the shepherd sat stoically, leash looped around Denham's wrist, the entire room seemed to revolve around him. The atmosphere was taut, stretched thin like a wire ready to snap. Spectators barely dared breathe. Even the scratching of a reporter's pen sounded too loud, drawing sharp glances from the bench. The weight of the proceedings pressed down on everyone equally, from the stenographer tapping rhythmically at her machine to the bailiff standing stiffly by the door. Each person carried the unspoken awareness that they were part of a story greater, and themselves. Near the back row, however, The weight of history and justice meant little. A young mother shifted in her seat, rocking gently as she tried to keep her restless toddler from fussing. She had debated not coming, but the trial fascinated her as much as everyone else in town. And with childcare unavailable, she had decided. She couldn't miss it. She whispered soothing words into her son's ear as he clutched a small toy car, tapping it lightly against the bench. His wide eyes darted from the judge to the lawyers, to the large dog that seemed almost too majestic. For the room. The little boy giggled softly, but his sound was swallowed by the silence around him. No one paid him much attention, at least not yet. At the prosecution's table, Assistant District Attorney Claire Morrison shuffled her notes into neat stacks, preparing her next move. She was sharp, ambitious, and fully aware that every camera outside the courthouse wanted a glimpse of her today. Across the aisle, the defense lawyer, a weathered man named Gerald Price, exhaled slowly and rubbed his temple. Price had seen enough trials to know that sometimes it wasn't the evidence that swayed a jury, but the theater of the courtroom itself, the moments that cut through monotony and etched themselves into memory. He only hoped those moments wouldn't turn against him today. The hands of the courtroom clock ticked toward 10, each second adding to the unbearable tension. Soon, the trial would resume. Soon, arguments would rise, objections would echo, and the air would thicken with the push and pull of justice. But for now, in the seconds before the storm, the silence was louder than any gavel strike. A cough from the gallery drew a sharp look from the bailiff. A juror shifted in her chair. The judge adjusted her glasses again. And the dog, the calm, unflinching dog, blinked once, his gaze sliding briefly toward the restless toddler in the back row before returning to the front of the room. It was in that fragile balance, the perfect stillness before voices clashed again, that the extraordinary would soon unfold. None of them knew it yet. Not the lawyers, not the jurors, not the reporters, not even the mother rocking her child. But history wasn't about to be written in the pages of legal arguments or the text of a verdict. It would arrive in a whisper, from the smallest voice in the room, shattering the tension in a way no one could predict. For now, though, the silence held. A silence heavy enough to crush, delicate enough to break with the smallest sound. The tense courtroom waited. The courtroom had been designed to intimidate. High ceilings loomed overhead, carved wooden beams crossing like ribs of a great beast, while the polished oak benches forced every spine to remain uncomfortably straight. Justice here was not a thing whispered or softened. It was carved into the architecture, an edifice to authority. And yet, in that austere space where silence ruled and seriousness weighed heavy, there was one sound no one had expected, the soft hum of a 2-year-old child. In the back row, Evelyn Carter shifted restlessly, trying to settle her son on her lap. She hadn't wanted to bring him. Lord knows, she had begged her sister to babysit, called neighbors, even asked a coworker to watch him for just a few hours. But every door had closed on her, and she had found herself facing a choice. Stay home and miss what promised to be the most talked-about day of the trial, or bring her son with her into the lion's den of the courtroom. Against her better judgment, curiosity had won. Now, with her son wriggling in her arms, Evelyn regretted that decision with every breath. She bounced him gently, whispering soothing words in his ear, the way mothers do when they are equal parts desperate and loving. Jamie, quiet now. We've got to be quiet. Jamie was not built for silence. His little legs kicked against the bench, his fingers drumming out a rhythm on the wooden rail in front of him. His toy car, chipped from being dragged across sidewalks and tabletops, clutched firmly in his tiny fist, became a percussion instrument as he tapped it against the seat. To him, this grand courtroom wasn't a place of solemnity. It was simply another room, filled with strangers, echoes, and a very large dog that had captured his attention from the moment they'd entered. Evelyn's heart thudded in her chest each time the toy made a clink against the wood. Every sound felt amplified in the charged silence. She could almost feel the weight of the bailiff's eyes boring into the back of her head, though in reality, he hadn't noticed yet. Still, she leaned forward, clutching Jamie's hand to still him. "Please, baby," she whispered. "We have to be still." But Jamie wasn't listening. His wide eyes were locked on the police dog at the front of the room. To him, the shepherd wasn't a symbol of law or evidence. It was simply the most magnificent creature he had ever seen. Its ears twitched like radar dishes. Its posture was proud and perfect. Jamie's small chest rose and fell quickly, excitement fluttering inside him like trapped birds. Meanwhile, the courtroom continued its careful dance of order. The prosecution's attorney shuffled her papers, preparing to stand. The defense. Lawyer scribbled notes, lips pursed. The judge adjusted her glasses, scanning the room with her trademark look of discipline that could silence even the most hardened witness. And yet, amid all that weighty attention, no one but Evelyn noticed her son's growing fascination. She could feel it in the way his body tensed against hers, in the way his little legs wiggled with unspent energy. He wanted down, badly. "No," she murmured, tightening her grip. But toddlers are not creatures who bargain. They push against rules with the pure force of curiosity, with the single-minded determination of those who don't yet understand consequence. Jamie wriggled harder. He squirmed like a fish in her lap, pushing against her arms until she struggled to hold him. Evelyn looked around desperately, cheeks flushing as she imagined the glares of the jury or the judge if he made a scene. She pulled a pack of crackers from her bag, but Jamie shoved them aside. His gaze never wavered from the dog. Then, in a movement so fast she barely registered it, he slid off her lap and landed with a small thud on the courtroom floor. The sound, that dull thunk of soft shoes against polished oak, seemed louder than a gunshot to Evelyn. Her breath caught in her throat. Around her, several heads turned, curious but not yet alarmed. "Jamie," she hissed, reaching out to grab him. But his tiny legs were already moving, carrying him forward into the aisle. Time seemed to slow. Evelyn lurched forward, hand outstretched, but missed. Her son waddled determinedly down the aisle, clutching his toy car in one hand, his other arm swinging freely. Every step echoed through the chamber. Reporters paused mid-sentence. Jurors tilted their heads. Even the defense lawyers stopped scribbling to glance up. Gasps began to ripple through the courtroom like pebbles tossed into still water. The bailiff straightened, uncertainty flickering across his face. It wasn't every day a toddler escaped into the well of the courtroom. He took a step forward, but the judge raised her hand almost imperceptibly. Judge Latham's eyes, sharp as steel, narrowed as she considered the scene unfolding. She was a woman who valued order above all else, but something in her expression suggested she understood that interfering too quickly might only escalate the chaos. Evelyn's cheeks burned crimson. She wanted to sink into the floor, to vanish, into the wooden panels of the bench. But all she could do was watch as her son toddled forward, closer and closer to the one presence in the room that had captivated him since the trial began. The police dog. Officer Denham felt the leash tighten slightly as the shepherd's ears perked. The animal had noticed the child's approach long before anyone else had fully processed it. The officer's hand tightened around the loop of leather, every muscle in his body preparing to reel the dog back if necessary. The shepherd did not move, but his dark eyes fixed on the child with a focus that made several jurors stiffen in their seats. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. The lawyers froze. The reporters leaned forward, pens hovering in the air. Even the defendant, who had spent much of the morning staring blankly at the table, turned his head to watch, curiosity flickering across his otherwise stony face. Only Jamie was unbothered. His little shoes tapped rhythmically on the floor. As he made his slow but steady journey down the aisle, a smile tugging at his lips. To him, it was all a grand adventure. He didn't see a trial. He didn't feel the weight of silence pressing down on everyone else. He saw only a beautiful, powerful dog sitting patiently, waiting for him. And so the toddler walked on, unaware that every eye in the room was locked on him, unaware that his next steps might alter the memory of this trial forever. The German shepherd sat as though he were carved from marble, a statue of discipline in a place where emotions often ran unchecked. Every line of his posture spoke of training, of repetition, of the countless hours spent perfecting obedience until his very stillness became a weapon. His handler, Officer Mark Denham, sat beside him with his hand resting lightly on the leash, though both knew the leash was more symbol than necessity. The shepherd was not just trained. He was forged. To the casual eye, he might have seemed simply a handsome dog, thick coat gleaming under the courtroom lights, ears pricked, eyes sharp and dark as whetstone. But anyone who knew the stories, and most in the room did, understood that this was no ordinary canine. He was Rex, the department's star, a legend whispered about in the same breath as the city's most seasoned detectives. He had been the turning point in cases that might otherwise have collapsed, his nose uncovering hidden caches, his instincts leading officers to fugitives thought long gone. Reporters had written about him. Children had sent letters to the police department, some with crayon drawings of Rex in his vest. The mayor himself had once called Rex the city's truest servant. For some in the courtroom, his presence carried as much weight as the judge's gavel. The jurors felt it. Several stole glances at him, their expressions mixed with awe and unease. They shifted in their seats when his ears twitched, as though every flick carried hidden judgment. To them, Rex was more than evidence. He was living. Testimony, silent but undeniable. And across the aisle, at the defendant's table, unease deepened. The man avoided Rex's eyes, his shoulders stiff each time the dog shifted slightly. To a guilty conscience, Rex was not a dog. He was the embodiment of discovery, the living reminder that secrets buried in dark corners could be dragged into the light. Officer Denham was aware of all of it, the jurors' stares, the journalists' whispered fascination, the defendant's twitching discomfort. But his focus remained on Rex. 20 years on the force had taught him that public opinion could sway like reeds in the wind, but discipline was unyielding. Rex was the product of that discipline. Denham had trained him from a wriggling pup into a professional whose very presence could silence a room. He remembered those early days vividly, the long nights on cold fields, the scent trails laid across parks and alleys, the drills repeated until Rex could detect a fragment of clothing buried under layers of earth. He remembered the first time Rex had found a missing child, the dog's bark piercing the woods like a clarion of hope. He remembered the drug bust where Rex had pawed insistently at a false wall until officers uncovered a stash worth millions. Every memory stitched itself into the dog's legend. And now that legend sat in a courtroom, still and silent, a witness whose very existence carried weight. Yet, Denham knew the truth beneath the legend. Rex was powerful, yes, and precise, but he was also a creature of heart. He knew loyalty, affection, and joy in ways the courtroom could not imagine. He was no machine. He was a soul. And that was what made him extraordinary. From his spot at the front of the room, Rex surveyed the gallery with quiet patience. His ears catalogued every cough, every shuffle, every nervous exhale. He caught scents invisible to human senses, the sharp tang of ink from the reporters, Pens, the faint sweetness of crackers tucked into a woman's bag at the back, a nervous perspiration of the defendant. His gaze, however, settled often on the aisle, on the tiny figure moving with uncertain steps toward him, the toddler. Rex's head tilted slightly, just enough for Denham to feel the shift through the leash. The officer followed the dog's gaze and saw the child inching closer, his small shoes tapping softly on the floor. Denham tensed immediately. The dog was steady, yes, but toddlers were unpredictable. They moved erratically, grabbed at things, pulled fur. The courtroom was not the place for experiments in patience. Denham's grip on the leash tightened. A lifetime of training shouted in his head, control the situation, control the environment. Yet he also knew Rex. The dog's stillness carried no aggression, only curiosity. His ears perked, but his body remained relaxed, his gaze intent but soft. The jurors noticed. A woman in the front row leaned slightly forward, her lips parting as she realized what was happening. One of the reporters scribbled furiously, sensing a headline forming even before the moment reached its climax. Across the room, Judge Latham's sharp eyes tracked the scene with a mix of annoyance and intrigue. But the person who felt it most was Evelyn, the child's mother. Her breath came in quick, shallow bursts as she rose halfway from her seat, torn between rushing forward and freezing under the weight of every eye in the room. She wanted to snatch her son back, to apologize, to vanish. Instead, she stood trembling, powerless to stop the inevitable meeting. And in the center of it all sat Rex, the dog with a reputation, not snarling, not stiff, but waiting. Waiting with the patience of one who had learned to see the world not in chaos, but in scents and tones and movements that spoke louder than human words. To him, the child's approach was not a disruption. It was simply an event to observe, another variable in a room filled with tension. His handler's tension flowed down the leash, yes, but Rex knew the difference between fear and control. He knew when to act and when to remain. The courtroom was a place of human drama, of laws and verdicts, guilt and innocence. But in that moment, all of it revolved around a dog whose calm discipline carried more gravity than any lawyer's argument. And though no one could see it yet, though no one could predict what words would soon leave the toddler's mouth, Rex was ready, not as evidence, not as spectacle, but as himself, a creature of loyalty, patience, and instinct, carrying a reputation that would soon deepen into legend. The whispers rippled again through the benches. The child toddled closer. The handler's hand clenched the leash tighter, and Rex, unshaken, waited for what would come. The silence in the courtroom had grown so taut, it felt like a thread about to snap. Every pair of eyes tracked the tiny figure moving down the center aisle, each step punctuated by the soft slap of toddler shoes against polished wood. It was the sort of sound no one should have noticed in a room filled with the hum of law, but somehow it echoed louder than the judge's gavel ever could. Jamie's toy car, clutched in his hand, swung lazily at his side as he walked, his other hand stretched slightly for balance. His hair fell into his wide eyes, which gleamed with excitement rather than fear. He did not see the defendant frowning at him, or the prosecutor frozen mid-note, or the 12 jurors holding their breath. He saw only the dog, magnificent, stoic, waiting. From the back, Evelyn half rose, her lips parting as if to call out. But the words caught in her throat. She knew the moment she spoke, her son would turn every head in the room her way, intensifying the humiliation. Her heart pounded against her ribs as she tried to will him back with nothing but the force of her desperate gaze. The bailiff shifted, uneasily, his hand hovering near the child, as though caught between duty and hesitation. It was not his place to manhandle a toddler in front of the jury, nor to let chaos unfold unchecked. For once, his eyes darted toward the bench, seeking silent instruction. Judge Laffin noticed. She noticed everything. Her sharp gaze swept from the bailiff to the child, to the dog, then back to the bailiff again. One small lift of her hand, subtle but decisive, froze him where he stood. Her lips tightened, but her eyes flickered with a thought she didn't share. She was a woman of law, and law demanded order. Yet in her decades on the bench, she had learned that some disruptions revealed more about human nature than carefully rehearsed testimony. At the front of the room, Rex shifted his weight just slightly, one ear turning forward, the other cocking back. His head lowered a fraction, his nostrils flaring to catch the new current of scent drifting toward him. The sweetness of crackers crushed into toddler fingers, the faint trace of fabric softener on a child's shirt, the pure, unfiltered innocence of youth. His handler, Officer Denham, immediately felt the change. The leash twitched, not with tension, but with awareness. "Easy," Denham whispered under his breath, though he knew the command was unnecessary. Rex was not alarmed. He was alert. The difference mattered. Jamie kept walking. His little face broke into a grin as he drew closer, oblivious to the gravity of his audience. To him, the shepherd was not a decorated officer of the law, not the center of a courtroom demonstration. To him, Rex was simply Doggy, big, beautiful, and waiting for a friend. The jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A man on the far end pressed his lips together, clearly suppressing a smile, while a woman beside him gripped her notebook like a lifeline. Some part of them knew this was inappropriate, a breach of solemnity. Yet another part of them, the part weary from weeks of testimony, found the sight strangely disarming. The prosecution's attorney, Claire Morrison, swallowed hard, torn between standing to object and staying seated. It wasn't clear what she would even object to. The child? The dog? The absurdity of it all prickled at her professionalism. She tapped her pen against her legal pad, trying to decide if silence was the wiser course. On the opposite side, Gerald Price, the defense lawyer, leaned back in his chair, his weathered face etched with lines from decades of courtroom battles, softened into the faintest trace of amusement. He had learned long ago that unpredictability could shake the very pillars of a trial. And if anything was unpredictable, it was a toddler marching fearlessly toward a police dog in front of a captive jury. The defendant, however, did not share the amusement. His eyes darted nervously from the child to the dog and back again, his jaw tightening. To him, Rex was not harmless. He was the reason he sat at that table, the reason his lies had crumbled. Watching a child walk toward the beast that had destroyed him filled him with unease he could not mask. Closer and closer Jamie came, his tiny shoes squeaking now with each step. The entire courtroom seemed suspended in that moment, balanced on the edge of absurdity and awe. Evelyn's pulse raced so fast she thought she might faint. She clutched the bench before her to keep herself grounded, silently begging her son to stop, to turn back, to please not do what she feared he would do next. But toddlers do not stop because adults will them to. They move with curiosity unchained, guided by instinct alone. And Jamie's instinct led him straight to Rex. He reached the well of the courtroom, standing barely taller than the great shepherd's head. For the first time, he paused, his little brow furrowed as he took in the sheer size of the animal before him. For all his fearlessness, Jamie was still 2 years old, and Rex was a giant in his world. The dog's broad chest rose and fell steadily, his eyes fixed on the child with a calmness that radiated like a shield. The room inhaled as one, every person frozen in the tableau. Jamie tilted his head, mimicking the dog without realizing it. His toy car slipped from his hand and clattered onto the floor with a sound that ricocheted through the chamber. Evelyn gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The bailiff flinched. Denham's grip on the leash tightened further. But Rex did not move. His gaze followed the toy briefly, and returned to the child, steady and patient. And then, without hesitation, Jamie stepped closer, closing the final space between innocence and authority. He reached out a small, sticky hand toward the dog's ear. The gesture was slow, uncertain, yet filled with an unshakable trust that only a child could offer. Gasps rippled through the benches. One juror actually whispered, "Oh my God," before catching herself. Reporters leaned forward, so far their pens nearly slipped from their fingers. Even Judge Latham's icy composure cracked for half a second, her lips pressing tightly together to suppress something dangerously close to a smile. The leash was taut in Denham's hand, but Rex remained motionless, waiting. The toddler's hand hovered inches from the dog's ear, the gap between them humming with an almost sacred tension. This was not just a child reaching for a dog. This was innocence colliding with authority, softness testing discipline, curiosity meeting reputation. The entire trial, with its heavy arguments and grim accusations, suddenly seemed small compared to this fragile, wordless encounter. For a moment, no one in the room breathed. No one dared break the silence. And in that silence, it became clear that something unforgettable was about to happen. The courtroom seemed to fold inward on itself, shrinking until there were only two figures at its center, a child and a dog. Everything else, the jury, the lawyers, the judge on her bench, the defendant at his table, blurred into insignificance. The world had funneled into a moment so delicate that even a cough might shatter it. Jamie's little hand hovered above Rex's ear, fingers sticky from crackers, trembling only because Toddler's movements trembled by nature. His toy car lay abandoned on the polished floor, forgotten in favor of something larger, something more magnetic. Rex did not move. The German shepherd's breathing remained steady, his chest rising and falling like the measured rhythm of a drumbeat. His dark eyes locked on the child, not with suspicion, but with something steadier, curiosity, patience, restraint. He knew instinctively the difference between threat and innocence. His instincts, honed through years of training, told him this small figure carried no malice, only wonder. And yet, every other heart in the courtroom thudded with unease. Evelyn's. Nails dug into the wooden bench as she leaned forward, frozen between terror and awe. Her maternal instincts screamed to rush forward and scoop her son into safety. But the collective silence of the courtroom chained her in place. She could feel the judge's gaze, the jury's watchful eyes, the reporter's pens poised for spectacle. To move now would make her part of the story, and every fiber of her body told her that the story already had its focus. Officer Denham held the leash taut, his knuckles white. Every muscle in his arm ached with restraint. He trusted Rex, yes, more than he trusted most people in this world. But he also knew unpredictability was a two-way street. Children tugged ears. They screamed suddenly. They toppled without warning. And even the most disciplined of dogs could misinterpret chaos. His lips parted, a warning caught at the edge of his throat, but he swallowed it back. To speak now would crack the silence like glass. The jury leaned as one organism, 12 bodies swaying imperceptibly forward. They were not conscious of it, but something in the sight of innocence confronting authority pulled them beyond their roles as arbiters of law. They were human first, witnesses to a story they would carry longer than the verdict itself. The defendant's lips curled into something unreadable. Contempt, fear, maybe disbelief. To him, the sight of a child closing in on the very animal that had ended his lives was a cruel twist, as though fate itself mocked him. He looked away quickly, jaw tightening until the muscles twitched. Jamie blinked once, twice, then leaned closer, his lips near Rex's ear. His voice, when it came, was barely more than a breath, but it carried with it the weight of innocence, of purity, of something that slipped past the heavy shields adults built around themselves. "Good boy." 2 words. That was all. But those 2 words detonated inside the silence like a firecracker. The shepherd's ears twitched, and in an instant, the rigid statue melted into something alive, vibrant. His tail wagged once, twice, then furiously, the sound of it thumping softly against the floor. His tongue lolloped out, and he leaned forward, pressing his wet nose against the child's cheek before delivering a lick so sudden and exuberant that Jamie squealed with delight. The squeal shattered the silence. Gasps burst from the gallery, rising like a tide of astonishment. The jurors, who had held their collective breath, exhaled in laughter and relief. One actually clapped a hand over her mouth, eyes shining with something dangerously close to tears. The reporters scribbled furiously, pens scratching so fast the sound itself became a chorus. The judge's gavel never fell, though it hovered inches from her hand. For a heartbeat, Judge Latham allowed herself what few had ever seen: a smile. It was brief, fleeting, but undeniably real. Evelyn sagged back into her seat, a trembling laugh escaping her lips even as tears stung her eyes. Relief coursed through her so strongly she felt faint. Her son was safe. More than safe. He was the center of something extraordinary. Officer Denham let the leash slacken, shoulders loosening for the first time in minutes. He stared at Rex, both proud and humbled. His partner, his unflinching, disciplined partner, had chosen gentleness without command. Denham whispered under his breath, words only Rex would hear. "That's it, boy. That's it." Jamie giggled, patting Rex's fur with unsteady little slaps that would have earned an adult a warning nip, but that the shepherd accepted with patience born of understanding. The boy's grin was wide, unburdened by any concept of trials or justice or reputations. To him, this was simple. He had met a friend, and the friend had kissed him. The room vibrated with something unnameable. It wasn't just relief or amusement or disbelief. It was warmth, a sudden surge of humanity in a place so often stripped of it. For weeks, this trial had been about lies and evidence, about facts bent to arguments and fear, sharpened into strategies. But in that one exchange, a whisper and a wag, the courtroom remembered that life was more than guilt and innocence. It was kindness. It was connection. For the jurors, the moment carved itself into memory. Some would never admit it, but they knew it had softened them, shifted the way they viewed the proceedings. They would continue to weigh evidence, yes, but a part of them would carry that image of purity sitting unafraid before authority, uncorrupted by fear. For the lawyers, the moment unsettled their strategies. Claire Morrison, the prosecutor, tapped her pen against her notes. Her usual confidence rattled. No cross-examination, no closing argument could compete with the power of what had just unfolded. Gerald Price, the defense lawyer, smirked faintly. He had no idea how to spin this, but he knew jurors were human first, and humanity had just stolen the show. And for the defendant, the moment was unbearable. He sat rigid, his fists clenched so tightly his nails bit into his palms. That dog, that damn dog, had ruined him once with discovery, and now again with affection. He looked away, jaw locked, refusing to watch, but the rest of the room could not look away. They drank it in, the innocence of the child, the gentleness of the beast, the gasps and the laughter, the ripple of warmth spreading outward like sunlight breaking through clouds. Eventually, Evelyn found the strength to move. She rose, cheeks flushed, and hurried forward, scooping Jamie into her arms. She whispered apologies to no one in particular, her voice trembling with embarrassment, but her smile betrayed her relief. Jamie protested with a whine, reaching back toward Rex, but she held him firmly, kissing his hair as though to ground herself in his safety. The judge cleared her throat softly, and the sound carried authority even without the gavel. Slowly, the laughter dimmed, the whispers faded, and the courtroom began to reassemble itself into order. Yet the air was changed, lighter, softer. Something irreversible had entered the room. Rex sat once more, posture regaining its discipline, though his tail still swished gently, betraying his contentment. His eyes followed Jamie as Evelyn carried him back to their seat, and for a fleeting moment, the two shared one last look, boy and dog, innocence and authority, friends for a heartbeat in the solemn theater of justice. The trial would continue. Arguments resuming, evidence presented. But no matter what verdict was reached, no matter what sentence delivered, the story had already been written in the hearts of those who had witnessed it. It was not a legal argument. It was not testimony. It was 2 words, whispered by a child. Good boy. The courtroom had shifted. What had been a rigid theater of rules and procedure now pulsed with something intangible but undeniable: humanity. The echoes of 2 whispered words, good boy, reverberated like a soft drumbeat through the room, and the reaction was immediate, visceral, and almost uncontrollable. Jurors blinked as though waking from a fog. They had been trained to listen to evidence, weigh facts, and ignore distractions. But this was not a distraction. It was a revelation. 12 individuals, chosen for their impartiality, sat frozen as the child's innocent act punctured the veneer of solemnity. Some leaned forward, others rested their hands against their mouths, and a few even dared small smiles, stifled yet genuine. The tension that had gripped them for weeks dissolved, replaced by astonishment and an unfamiliar warmth. The reporters, who had initially poised themselves for notes on testimony and legal strategy, scrambled to capture what had unfolded. Pens moved frantically across pads, cameras clicked, and whispers rippled between journalists like tiny sparks. "Did you see that?" one whispered. He whispered to the dog. And the dog. The awe was palpable, spilling across rows of seats. No one had expected a courtroom so heavy with accusation to be broken by a child's soft voice and a dog's patient response. Even the judge, Judge Harriet Latham, was not immune. Known for her stern expression and unwavering command, she felt an odd tug at her chest, a crack in the otherwise immovable armor of her professionalism. Her lips twitched, betraying a faint, fleeting smile that she immediately masked with a cough. For a single moment, she allowed herself the recognition that some acts transcend law, that innocence can assert its power even in spaces designed for authority. She straightened in her seat, adjusted her glasses, and with the quietest of nods signaled the bailiff to hold his position. Evelyn, the mother, was trembling in her seat. Her pulse had slowed slightly since she had scooped Jamie into her arms, yet her chest felt tight with residual panic. Relief warred with embarrassment, and she kept whispering apologies to no one, cradling her son as if protecting him from both judgment and the weight of what had just occurred. Yet, beneath the flustered nerves, she was quietly marveling at the moment. Her child, so small, had produced a force more powerful than any argument or display in the courtroom. Pure, uncalculated kindness. Rex, the dog, remained at the front, tail slowly wagging, ears twitching as if savoring the attention without needing it. He had returned to his disciplined posture, yet his calm presence continued to dominate the room. Officer Denham's grip on the leash relaxed fully for the first time, shoulders dropping in relief. He studied his partner, not a weapon, not a tool, but a living, breathing, thinking, feeling being who had just responded to innocence with gentle acknowledgement. The bond between them, forged through years of training and shared missions, was evident even to those who understood nothing of police work. The defendant, however, could hardly believe what he was seeing. His jaw remained tight, hands clasped into fists. He stared at the interaction with disbelief, eyes darting from child to dog and back again. For him, the scene was unbearable. Rex had become more than evidence. He had become a symbol of what the defendant had lost control over. Even now, the defiance of the dog's gentle acceptance and the child's fearless approach reminded him of mistakes he could neither undo nor escape. His lips pressed thinly together, and he forced himself to look away, focusing on the table as if doing so could erase the tableau from existence. The attorneys, too, were unsettled. Claire Morrison, the prosecutor, found her meticulous arguments momentarily suspended in the air. She had anticipated presenting Rex as evidence of disciplined training, a tool to prove meticulous investigation. She had never imagined a toddler's whisper would redefine the entire room, eclipsing the weight of her carefully constructed narrative. Across the aisle, Gerald Price, the defense attorney, allowed himself a brief smirk, recognizing that no legal argument could compete with the power of innocence witnessed in real time. The jury's softened expressions, the ripple of laughter and gasps, had subtly altered the dynamics of the courtroom. The bailiff remained motionless, a statue of authority and caution. He had prepared for disruption, for misbehavior, for any number of deviations from protocol. But this was not disruption. It was wonder, a tiny flash of human connection that didn't require intervention, just observation. Even he allowed himself the smallest internal nod, recognizing the rare magic of the moment. In the gallery, spectators whispered in awe. Some covered their mouths to stifle laughter. Others shook their heads as though trying to reconcile the absurdity of a courtroom so serious being touched by something so innocent. The combined tension of anticipation, fear, and expectation dissolved under the sheer simplicity of a child's kindness and a dog's loyalty. It was a shockwave that no one had anticipated, yet it felt, for everyone present, completely inevitable once it happened. Time itself seemed to stretch. The gavel remained untouched. The stenographer continued typing, but the rhythm of the courtroom had shifted. It was no longer only about facts, evidence, or verdicts. The energy of the room had been transformed, humanized, softened by the echo of innocence and the warmth of the simple act. Even the jurors, trained to filter emotion, could not remain unmoved. Some smiled openly. Others sat with hands pressed over their mouths, trying to contain reactions they had never anticipated feeling. One juror's eyes glistened with moisture as she tried to refocus on her notes, unable to shake the image of a toddler's small hand touching a police dog with complete trust and adoration. Jamie, oblivious to the awe he had inspired, wriggled happily in his mother's arms, patting Rex gently. His giggles carried across the courtroom, a musical punctuation mark to the tension, a reminder that life was larger than the solemnity of any trial. Evelyn whispered calming words, but there was no fear in her son, only delight. And in that delight, the room found its own release. Rex, for his part, had already returned to his disciplined posture, though his tail flicked occasionally in subtle acknowledgement of the affection he had received. Officer Denham exhaled, the first deep, unguarded breath he had allowed himself since the trial began. He studied Rex, noting the patience, the gentle judgment, the understanding that only a creature like this could possess. For a professional dog, this was routine, but in a courtroom full of humans, it was extraordinary. The judge, finally, allowed herself to speak. Her voice cut through the reverent silence, calm but authoritative. "Let us return to order," she said, yet her tone carried warmth, almost as if acknowledging the extraordinary moment without needing to articulate it fully. The words were not a reprimand, but a gentle guide, steering the courtroom back toward its official purpose while preserving the memory of what had occurred. Even as the trial slowly resumed, the impact lingered. Witnesses, lawyers, jurors, and spectators carried the echoes of that brief, profound interruption. For weeks or even years, when recounting the trial, people would remember not only the arguments, the evidence, or the verdict, but the child and the dog, the whisper that changed the room, and the collective gasp of a courtroom reminded of innocence and loyalty. It was a small miracle, subtle yet undeniable. 2 words had done what years of argument, hours of testimony, and the gravitas of law had struggled to achieve. They had reminded everyone present of humanity. And in that shared moment of awe, the trial, heavy with accusations and defenses, was reframed, if only for a heartbeat, into something greater than itself, a living testament to the power of simplicity, of trust, and of pure, uncalculated love. The courtroom had changed. The rigid boundaries of law, the weight of precedent, the meticulous choreography of lawyers and witnesses, all had been momentarily softened by a single small act. The whisper of 2 words, "Good boy," and the gentle response of the police dog had shifted the energy of the room. It was subtle but undeniable. The trial's gravity remained, but it now carried a new undercurrent, one no one could ignore. Jurors, previously tense and deliberate, began to relax. Their shoulders, once stiff with the weight of responsibility, loosened slightly. Eyes that had darted nervously at lawyers' gestures or scribbled notes now lingered, observing human connections unfold in quiet, astonishing ways. The jury box no longer felt like a cage of judgment, but like a shared space of witness, not just to evidence, but to something intangible, profound. Some jurors exchanged small glances. A woman in the front row raised an eyebrow, then pressed her fingers lightly to her lips, suppressing a smile. The man beside her leaned slightly forward, watching the mother and child in awe, noticing how even the court's sternest figures had been momentarily softened. They had been trained to weigh facts and reason through logic, but this interaction appealed to the deepest human instincts, empathy, recognition of innocence, the inexplicable pull of kindness. The attorneys, too, were affected, though they fought to maintain composure. Claire Morrison, the assistant district attorney, found herself tapping the pen absent-mindedly against her notes, a nervous gesture betraying her awareness that the courtroom dynamic had subtly shifted. She had entered the trial confident that evidence, argument, and authority would dominate the room. But now she realized the power of human connection, unplanned, spontaneous, had rewritten the emotional landscape. Across the aisle, Gerald Price, the defense lawyer, leaned back in his chair with a knowing expression. He had long understood the unpredictability of human nature, the ways that empathy and emotion could influence judgment. Now, watching the jurors soften, hearing muffled smiles ripple through the audience, he felt a rare surge of quiet hope. Perhaps, he thought, this moment might remind the jury that the world was not only black and white, that compassion and understanding could coexist with law. Even the defendant seemed affected, though unwilling to admit it. His eyes followed the interaction between mother, child, and dog with a tension that betrayed both fear and fascination. He understood, in some deep, instinctive way, that what had happened was beyond evidence or strategy. It was symbolic, a reminder that some forces in life could not be measured or controlled, no matter how clever one believed oneself to be. The gallery, crowded with spectators and journalists, buzzed softly. Whispers floated like gentle currents through the benches. "Did you see that?" someone murmured. The dog, the child. Cameras had captured the moment, but no lens could convey the atmosphere, the almost sacred hush that had allowed the event to unfold with such power. Every observer recognized they had been witness to something rare, ephemeral, yet enduring. Rex, The police dog remained alert but patient. He had returned to his disciplined posture, tail flicking occasionally in subtle acknowledgement of the boy's presence. To the untrained eye, he might have seemed unchanged, but Officer Denham understood. Rex had chosen a delicate balance, recognition of innocence without surrendering his authority. It was a lesson in control, restraint, and empathy, the kind of lesson no courtroom manual could provide. The mother, Evelyn, held her son a little tighter. She whispered calming words, but the tension in her chest had diminished. For weeks, she had worried about every minor detail: the child's restlessness, the reactions of strangers, the scrutiny of authority. Yet this singular, unplanned moment had revealed something larger: trust, patience, and the human capacity for wonder could exist even in the strictest environments. Slowly, the trial resumed, but the energy had shifted. Witnesses spoke, lawyers presented arguments, evidence was examined, yet everything carried the soft glow of the symbolic moment. Jurors appeared more attentive, not just to the legal facts, but to the human story unfolding before them. The room, once heavy with tension and formality, now breathed with a quiet, shared understanding. Observers noticed subtle transformations. A previously skeptical juror smiled openly at the gentle interaction between child and dog. A reporter, who had anticipated writing dry notes on legal procedure, found herself scribbling phrases like innocence and trust in the margins. Even the judge's stern demeanor bore traces of reflection, her eyes softening as she observed the courtroom's collective response. The defendant, however, could not shake the shift. Each glance toward the jurors reminded him of the invisible impact of the moment. He had come prepared to argue facts, evidence, and legal interpretations, yet here he was confronted with forces beyond his control: empathy, wonder, and the undeniable power of innocence. As the trial progressed, the symbolic nature of the Toddler's act began to take root in the minds of everyone present. The child's courage, the dog's gentle acknowledgement, and the collective response created a narrative that transcended law. It became a reminder that courtroom, while a space of rules and procedure, was also a theater for human experience. Every person present was part of that narrative, whether they realized it or not. Even small details carried newfound meaning. The click of the stenographer's keys, once mechanical, seemed to participate in the rhythm of a living, breathing room. The subtle shifting of jurors in their seats became less about fatigue and more about engagement with a story larger than themselves. Even the polished oak of the benches and the high ceilings, which had once symbolized authority and rigidity, now seemed like a stage set for connection and revelation. By mid-morning, the courtroom had transformed. The symbolic shift was subtle but powerful. Law and authority were still present, but they were now tempered by the reminder of human potential, empathy, and innocence. Every argument, every witness, every piece of evidence would carry a shadow of that moment, a tiny, indelible mark left by a child's courage and a dog's patience. It was clear that history would remember not just the verdict, but the invisible thread woven through the trial that day. A thread of kindness, trust, and symbolic resonance that transformed the courtroom from a place of tension into a space of shared humanity. And in the midst of all this, Rex remained the silent teacher, a living embodiment of restraint, discipline, and the gentle acknowledgement of innocence. He had reminded the human participants that even in spaces dominated by rules, empathy could guide behavior, influence perception, and alter the course of experience. By the time lunch recess arrived, conversations hummed quietly among the spectators and journalists, almost reverently. "Did you see the way he wagged his tail?" one whispered. "The child and the dog, it was like magic," said another. Even the jurors, bound by duty and decorum, carried smiles that could not be fully suppressed. At trial, now continuing, felt less like a mechanical unfolding of evidence and more like a shared story in which every participant, from the youngest child to the most seasoned officer, played a role. The symbolic shift was complete. The courtroom had recognized, however silently, that innocence and authority could coexist, that moments of connection could ripple through the rigid structures of law, and that the smallest acts could leave the largest impressions. And so, as witnesses returned to the stand and arguments resumed, the courtroom carried on with a quiet sense of balance restored. The moment had changed everything, not in the rules, not in the evidence, but in the hearts of everyone present. The whispered words of a child and the patient acknowledgement of a dog had shifted the narrative irreversibly, transforming the trial into more than a legal proceeding. It had become a story of humanity. The courtroom had returned to its prescribed rhythm, yet it was forever changed. Witnesses continued their testimony. Lawyers presented arguments with renewed diligence, and the judge maintained her authoritative presence. But the memory of what had transpired, the child, the whispered words, and the dog's gentle acknowledgement, lingered in every corner, shaping perceptions, softening judgments, and leaving an invisible imprint on the hearts of all present. For the jurors, the impact was profound. They shifted in their seats with a quiet awareness, each movement now carrying the echo of innocence and trust. Where once their deliberations might have been mechanical, guided solely by facts and legal instruction, now they found themselves acutely conscious of human elements, the nuances of empathy, the value of kindness, the fragile courage it took for a child to confront authority without fear. Some clasped their hands together, resting their chins lightly, replaying the moment in their minds, as though it were a piece of evidence in itself. One juror, a middle-aged man with graying temples, felt the shift more keenly than most. He had entered the trial believing himself impervious to sentiment, committed only to logic and duty. Yet the sight of a toddler standing unafraid before a police dog, whispering the simplest of praises, had unsettled him. For a brief, unforgettable instant, he had remembered his own childhood, the moments of trust he had shared with the family. Pet, the fearless wonder of exploring a world larger than himself. He realized that the courtroom, the law, and justice itself were not separate from human experience. They existed within it, intertwined and inseparable. Across the room, reporters scribbled with fervor, though now their notes carried more than factual statements. Their descriptions captured nuance, emotion, and symbolism. One reporter wrote, "In a courtroom of cold facts and solemn faces, a child's whisper reminded us all of humanity." Cameras had frozen frames, yet none could fully capture the gravity of the collective realization that had spread like sunlight through the benches. The attorneys, too, were affected in subtle ways. Claire Morrison, who had initially felt the child's interruption was a distraction, now recognized the strategic power of human perception. She understood that the jurors were no longer mere vessels of logic. They had been awakened to the broader implications of empathy and trust. Each of her words, each argument she delivered thereafter, was weighed not just for legal validity, but for its resonance with the human heart. Gerald Price, observing the courtroom's softened energy, allowed himself a rare sense of cautious optimism. He had known that evidence alone did not shape verdicts entirely. Human emotion always played a role, subtle yet decisive. Now he had witnessed it unfold organically. The whispered, "good boy," and Rex's gentle acceptance had become a symbol, a touchstone, a reminder that justice must always consider humanity alongside legality. Even the defendant could not ignore the moment's resonance. Though he fought to maintain composure, his eyes betrayed a flicker of realization. The tableau of a child's fearless curiosity and a dog's unyielding patience had subtly reframed the courtroom. He understood, however reluctantly, that there were forces beyond strategy, beyond evidence, and beyond control. Actions rooted in trust and kindness could pierce the defenses of the most calculated minds, leaving impressions that no argument could erase. For Evelyn and Jamie, the experience lingered with quiet intensity. Evelyn, finally settling into her seat, cradled her son and reflected on the extraordinary series of events. She marveled at the courage he had shown, a courage unclouded by calculation or expectation. Jamie, oblivious to the monumental impact of his actions, giggled softly as he played with his toy car, periodically glancing at Rex with unabashed admiration. To him, the dog was simply a friend, loyal and majestic, and that simplicity had altered the hearts of everyone who witnessed it. Rex, alert yet composed, remained seated at the front, embodying discipline, loyalty, and the quiet power of recognition. Officer Denham kept a protective hand on the leash, but his stance had softened. He understood that his partner had just demonstrated something extraordinary: the ability to affirm innocence, to communicate trust, and to bridge the gap between authority and vulnerability without a single word. As the day unfolded, the courtroom carried the memory of that brief, magical moment. The trial continued, arguments proceeded, and evidence was examined. Yet the emotional atmosphere had been irrevocably transformed. Participants moved with heightened awareness, listening more carefully, observing more thoughtfully, and engaging, not only with law, but the humanity surrounding it. By mid-afternoon, whispers circulated through the gallery. Spectators exchanged quiet reflections on what they had witnessed. "It was incredible," one murmured. "A child, just a whisper, and a dog. It changed everything." Another nodded, replying, "It wasn't just about evidence. It was about trust, connection, and courage." These murmurs, small yet potent, reinforced the symbolic weight of the moment, ensuring that it would endure beyond the confines of the courtroom walls. Even outside the courtroom, the story began to spread. Social media feeds buzzed with descriptions of the incident. Journalists framed headlines to capture both the factual and emotional significance. Toddlers whisper to police, dog halts. Courtroom, read one headline. Child, dog, and courage redefine trial atmosphere, read another. The narrative transcended legal discourse, reaching a broader audience captivated by the intersection of innocence and authority. By evening, when the trial adjourned for the day, those present left carrying a shared sense of awe. Jurors returned to their homes, replaying the moment in memory, carrying the realization that justice was intertwined with human understanding. Attorneys reflected on strategy with a new awareness of empathy's subtle influence. Reporters filed stories that would linger in public consciousness, ensuring that the event's resonance extended beyond the courtroom. Evelyn and Jamie walked down the courthouse steps, hand in hand, their hearts still buoyed by the day's extraordinary events. Jamie glanced up at Rex one last time, as if offering silent thanks, and Rex responded with a slow, deliberate tail wag, a gesture that needed no words to communicate understanding. Evelyn smiled through tears, realizing that this day would remain etched in memory, not for the trial's legal outcomes, but for the profound human connection her child had sparked. Officer Denham returned Rex to the vehicle with care, reflecting on the extraordinary demonstration of patience, discipline, and empathy he had witnessed firsthand. He knew that the dog's actions, guided by instinct yet tempered with understanding, had communicated something far greater than obedience or training, a bridge between innocence and authority, a reminder that even in spaces of law and judgment, there is room for trust, respect, and recognition of humanity. The courtroom, now empty, retained a lingering aura. The polished wood, high ceilings, and imposing benches seemed subtly altered, infused with the memory of a moment that had transcended the ordinary, the procedural, and the expected. It was a testament to the unexpected power of simplicity, courage, and connection. A reminder that even in the gravest of settings, the smallest gestures can leave the largest marks. And as the sun set beyond the courthouse windows, casting long, golden beams across the chamber, one truth remained clear: the whisper of a child and the patient acknowledgement of a dog had created a memory that would endure far longer than any verdict, far longer than any argument, far longer than the trial itself. It was a moment remembered, not for its legal significance, but for its profound demonstration of humanity. In the years to come, when participants recounted the trial, they would speak not only of testimony, evidence, and outcomes, but of a small boy, a legendary dog, and the two words that had shifted everything: good boy. And in that shared memory, the courtroom, and everyone who had witnessed it, had been forever changed.